Welcome back to Uprising, Professor Jody Armour.
Good to be back, Sonali.
Thanks so much for joining us. So we had you on yesterday, and I really felt like our conversation was incomplete. And so I really want to get into some more issues around how the spectrum of racism in the U.S. stretches from things like simply being followed around by security guards at a department store all the way to being seen as so dangerous by a policeman that you're shot to death, even if you don't even have a weapon or aren't acting aggressively. I'm wondering what you make of the fact that when people grow up within this kind of culture, when they themselves are on the receiving end of the racism, what are the sort of conversations that take place within the community? What are the sort of conversations that take place between parents and children?
Yeah, well, I'll tell you the kind of conversations I've had to hold with my own three sons. My oldest, I'm going to admit that I have sent them to private schools because I live in South Central and the public schools have not been so great. Crenshaw lost its accreditation in 2005-06, high school, for example. So they go to private schools, which means most of their friends are white. He was hanging out with his white friends. He was accosted by a police officer, and he noticed that he was, at 9 years of age, with his 9-year-old friends, he noticed that he was treated differently than his white friends. And he came back and he complained to me about it. And I told him, I had that difficult conversation that a lot of black parents have to have with their black male children in particular, but also female. That's another can of worms. Right. We'll get into it another time as well. But that conversation with him that you are not white. You know, the reality is, as a 9-year-old, that you have to come to grips with, the social reality, Allende, is that you aren't white. And you can't act as if you were. You're going to be treated differently, and you have to be aware that you're going to be treated differently. The threshold for you is lower than for them. And it's not that they're bad or anybody's bad. The world isn't hostile or bad because of that. It just means we're part of a struggle. We're part of a beautiful struggle that goes back to slavery, goes back to when we came out of the hulls of those ships, goes through Jim Crow, and now we're in the third phase, mass incarceration and police brutality in a mass police state. So we're in the third phase. We've come through the first two phases. We have to come through this one, and you just have to accept that additional struggle.
I mean, it's amazing and just heartbreaking to think about the fact that a parent has to have that conversation with their child. And I'm wondering what you think about the fact that perhaps the long-term solution to this sort of issue is white parents having conversations with their white children about this issue and about how they should think about it when they see it happening to their friends, and how they should not be part of that problem. But of course, probably most white parents don't do that.
Yeah, that would be so helpful, even though it might not get rid of unconscious bias itself, because that's a mental reflex that's established at an early age.
But exactly, that's the point, right?
Right. So they can't. But for the parents to have the conversation with their kids, white parents with their kids, would be so valuable in helping us avoid moments like this in which you have two different social realities apparently perceived by whites versus blacks. White folks, when they do the studies, really don't see racism as virulent today as blacks do. Even though we have now Ferguson and we have New York and we have mass incarceration, the polls again and again say that we're living in different social realities, whites and blacks. The whites really don't see the racism that blacks say we're suffering so much. They think that it's kind of hyperbole, kind of overblown. It can't be really that bad. And so that conversation would help to cut through some of that.
Right. And so we had this Pew Research Center poll that just reflected that. And we've seen that institution has done similar polls in the past around similar moments where we see white perspectives versus black perspectives on the same incident. And whites are twice, or rather half as likely than blacks to see issues of racism. And I'm wondering, one of the sort of red herrings that's often brought up in the white denial of everyday racism, but also violent racism that face blacks, is this issue of of black-on-black violence. Well, how come you guys aren't looking at blacks killing blacks at these huge numbers? How do you respond to that?
Yes. No, that's called let's change the subject. That's called let's create a red herring and distract from the conversation at hand, because it sounds good initially. It sounds like, oh, well, if you care about black lives, then why don't you care about the black lives that are being taken at the hands of other blacks, all right? As much as you care about the black lives that are being taken at the hands of officers. Well, here's one immediate difference. Officers take an oath of office to uphold the Constitution. We give them a monopoly over legitimate violence. We give them the badge and the gun, and they hold that office in trust. They're trustees, and part of their trust relationship is that they're going to conform to people's rights and to the requirements of the Constitution. And most importantly, when officers go out and kill or whatever they do it on our behalf and in our name. They are killing in our name. The gangbanger not killing in our name. He's not a trustee. He hasn't taken an oath. He's in no way comparable to the police officer who we are all complicit with. There's complicity between what officers do and what we do in our political community, rather, in a way that there isn't between what the gangbanger does in our political community. So, yes, what the officer does, he does in our name. So we don't want him discriminating in our name, and it's especially grievous when he does, and it connects to all this other discrimination that we're talking about, all the other black tax, all the other ways stereotypes really are microaggressions that spirit murder black people. So that's the immediate difference, and that's a pretty obvious difference. The only reason it's not more often acknowledged and seen is for rhetorical purposes only. They're trying to change the subject and distract us from the very issue at hand.
And we never seem to hear about white-on-white violence, do we? Which is quite egregious. I heard some statistic around something like 70 or 80% of violent crimes committed against whites are by whites.
Most crime is intraracial. Most crime is intraracial. And let's not throw in, if you want to compare crime rates, when it comes to violent crime and crimes of desperation over economic issues, blacks are going to outnumber whites because they're more concentrated in desperate circumstances. But when it comes to other crimes like date rape, all of a sudden, and rape in general, but especially date rape, the white crime rates are going to be comparable, if not greater than black, because you have more access. Unfortunately, a lot of blacks aren't going to a lot of these elite private white campuses, universities, and colleges, so they're not on frat row. And they're not at a lot of these functions where a lot of these kinds of crimes are really happening. So, depending on how we define crime, we can find crime rates among whites very similar to those of blacks. But I'm not going to deny for a minute that crimes of economic necessity, duress, stress are disproportionately happening in the black community because they're disproportionately strapped and desperate and stressed when it comes to economics.
And then we have in the state of California these laws, the 3 strikes laws, that are literally designed to create a situation where somebody driven by desperation may end up serving a life sentence because they might have stolen food, whether they did or not, but they might have done enough things and been caught enough times that whether or not they were driven by desperate circumstances is not an issue, and suddenly they're in prison for life.
And the example I have to keep coming back to because it's so useful and it shines a light on the problem of a pure politics of pigmentation is Jackie Lacey, the DA of L.A. County now, first black woman, got a conviction of 25 to life against an 18-year-old black boy who had 2 priors of purse snatching. Jay-Z, you said, purse snatching, sometimes that's what you got to do to persevere when your stomach is grumbling from hunger, right? So he had, but I'm not excusing it. I'm just saying 2 snatching purse incidents when he was 16 then, and when he was 18, he went into the back of an unoccupied car parked in Targets and took a cell phone. Jackie Lacey tried him and got 25 to life for that when the judge, in a rare feat of judicial intervention, stepped in and said, no, I'm going to knock that down to 7 years because it shocked my conscience, even 7 years for a cell phone, but it shocked my conscience. She objected and said, no, 25 to life. That's our mentality toward crime and punishment, blame and punishment, and that's from an And that's from a member of the very community that we're talking about that's suffering most of the mass incarceration that you expect more empathy. And she said at the time she had her own 18-year-old son. So she still didn't see the connect. Here's the problem, I think, Sonali. It goes back to a Chris Rock skit that he did about over 12, 13, 14 years ago, in which he said, I love black people, but I hate N-words. I'm just going to use that. I hate N-words. You know how vicious. I hate N-word. He was drawn, and he defined an N-word as any black who's done a crime. So what he's saying is that, and I've just put this in my book, up to 90% of young black males in some of these inner city neighborhoods are going to wind up in jail, on probation, or on parole at some point in their lives. According to Rock's moral universe, 90% of those kids are N-words. That's how we've come to, and by the way, since crime rates between middle-class whites and middle-class blacks are roughly the same, most of those N-words, most of those black criminals are poor black criminals, and most of the law-abiding blacks are middle-class blacks like Obama, like me, like Eric Holder. So what Chris Rock is really inviting us to do is distinguish between us and them on the basis of criminal wrongdoing that's driven by economic need and duress.
So this is an issue of class.
Class. That's it. We can't escape the intersection of race and class, but at some point we got to talk class. And we got to talk how somebody like Obama is running around talking about personal responsibility every chance he gets, wagging his fingers at Morehouse graduates about personal responsibility, and how that just feeds a right-wing narrative and not one that really recognizes the macro-level social factors that drive crime.
Now, Professor Armour, there was a report that was issued just last week as the protests in Ferguson were peaking by a group of a nonprofit lawyers group called Arch City Defenders that shows how an impoverished community like African Americans in Ferguson, which could be any community in so many different cities in the United States, have been on a very systemic level been targeted legally and impoverished by the legal system. So the study was about the municipal court in Ferguson that showed how it has become the second highest source of income for the city because of fines and court fees issued in a community of just 21,000 people that total over $2.5 million. This court has about an average of 3 warrants a year, 3 arrest warrants a year per household, and of course the majority of them blacks rather than whites. Even if whites, when they are stopped, for example, by Ferguson police, are actually more likely to be carrying things like contraband than black individuals who might be stopped, 34% versus 21%. And so we're seeing this kind of legal persecution of a community that can explain a part of the outrage that we've seen on the streets of Ferguson. Those protests didn't come out of nowhere. They weren't just sparked by one murder. Yeah,
you put your finger right on something important, Sonali, that at the end of the day, we're talking about money. We're talking about a multi-million-dollar enterprise. And we're talking about it in the context of a regressive tax. We're talking about black folks subsidizing the municipal coffers through law enforcement being brought to bear on them. That's a cruel, regressive tax. That's why I call a lot of the work I'm doing in this area the black tax, the various faces of the black tax. And this is one of the faces of the black tax, the cruelly regressive face. And we got to recognize that there are economic incentives for mass incarceration and for over-policing. And you put your finger right on it. That's called smoking gun evidence that you just pointed out. Men lie, women lie, numbers don't. And you just pointed out some damning, indicting numbers, right, that demonstrate clearly there's an incentive to over-police and to over-incarcerate and to over-sanction of the black community, especially if it's going to redound to the material benefit of the white community around it. And mainly the police officers, as we saw in Ferguson, are the white community, the representatives of the white community, not the black community. So the money they're making is going out of the black community and into the white community. So once we step back and look at it structurally in that way, we can see through a lot of the tissue of morality and personal responsibility and the other stuff that covers up what's really going on underneath. Economic interests that are being promoted and protected by the mass incarceration of a group of people that nobody particularly gives a damn about. Who cared about Katrina, right? You had, like I keep coming back to, you had Sean Penn paddling up there 4 days in before FEMA could get there because there wasn't that panic of empathy for these black folk who were in this plight. I suspect there would be a much greater panic of empathy if I sat here before you, Sonali, and said that 90% of the young white males in Manhattan Beach were in jail on probation, on parole before they, before they got out of their adulthood. That 90%, you'd say, whoa, wait, but those are the numbers for the jungle. Those are the numbers for parts of South Central and Watts.
Yeah. So finally, Professor Armour, you teach at the University of Southern California, and there may be some anecdotal and perhaps some hard numbers, anecdotal evidence that may give us the sense that either because younger generations tend to be more progressive or because they're growing up with social media in ways that can enable them to have more conversations, do you see younger people, regardless of race, being more open to the idea of accepting racism is happening and being more open to the idea of rejecting that racism and developing greater empathy?
Great question. I do see it. That gives me hope. It gets me out of bed every morning. Just 1 year ago at SC, a black graduation party was broken up by 79 riot police in riot gear, and a helicopter were brought in. We had a big town hall meeting. The police commission, upper brass were brought there. Everyone came after the event. And while I was standing there moderating this town hall about to break up a black graduation party, a little off campus, we had this big town hall about it. As I was standing there, I took questions from the audience, and some white students were some of the first to the mics. And this is all recorded. And they said, we were having a party right next door. Ours was just as rowdy, just as loud. The police came over to our party and didn't do anything. They just said, tone it down. They brought in 79 riot police for them. You had a controlled experiment in which you controlled for every variable now. Rowdiness, party, same night. Only difference is the racial identity of the people at the parties, and you see the different reactions. And this is the students bringing this out. And we had 1,000 students in this auditorium who had come for this town hall meeting, right? And they were the ones being proactive in assessing the situation and recognizing what was going on, the militarization of the LAPD to some extent, the militarized response to this graduation party by these black kids, and the fact that it was different. So that's my hope, that you do have the students themselves being proactive and taking the lead on this.
Well, on that slightly brighter note, I want to thank you so much, Professor Jody Armour, for spending this time with us, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me, Sonali.